Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's democracy seminar. Before we begin today's discussion, please join me in acknowledging that the land on which Harvard sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people at a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. My name is Archon Fung, and I'm on the faculty at the Kennedy School. I help organize the democracy programming here. And I'd like to thank you for joining this important discussion about some of the deep structural features of American democracy that may be generating the problems, the deep problems that we're experiencing. There is no one, I made a list of books to try to understand the current moment, just kind of for myself last week. And at the very top of the list was Lee Drutman's book, The Two-Party Doom Loop, The Case for Multi-Party Democracy in America. And we're really fortunate here this afternoon to be joined by Lee, who is a senior fellow in the program for political reform at New America. He's written many books, not just The Two-Party Doom Loop, but The Business of America is Lobbying. And these books have won many prizes, including the Robert Dahl Award for scholarship of the highest quality on a subject of democracy. You may have heard Lee on other programs. He's the co-host of the podcast Politics and Question, and writes for the New York Times, Vox, and 538. Today's discussion comes at a good time. I don't know how many people have read Tom Edsel's piece in the New York Times today about the problems democracy faces, and he draws on Lee's work a whole lot for what we might look to do to make things better. And I posted a link to Tom Edsel's piece in the chat for those of you who are interested in checking it out. So welcome, Lee. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to be having this conversation, and thank you for the incredibly kind introduction. Really excited for this conversation.
Great. So I will open it up with a few general questions, and then we'll reserve some time, maybe 15, 20 minutes after my structured questions for audit questions from the audience, which is very robust today. A lot of people interested in this subject. So first question, what do you think about the Biden administration emphasis and priority on unity and reaching across the aisle? I want to get started by asking you a little bit about partisanship and how bad do you think it is? Does President Biden have better or worse chances than President Obama did at reaching across the aisle, which President Obama had very much hoped to do?
Yeah, well, I think there's a deep desire among the American people to see us kind of come together as a nation. And so Biden's message of unity, I think, resonates with a lot of people. But in practice, it's very difficult to do for the same reasons that Obama found it extremely difficult to achieve bipartisan compromise, because our system is set up with two parties who are competing to achieve narrow majority control for Congress. And the way that the Republican Party sees its path back to power is by casting the Biden administration as dangerous and extreme, as casting the Democrats as dangerous and extreme. And by cooperating with the Biden administration, with Democrats in Congress, they're effectively legitimating Democratic policies, Democratic priorities. And what the Republican Party is going to try to do, the same thing that it did when Obama was in power, is to obstruct, to create a sense that whatever Democrats are doing is too extreme. And so I don't think the chances for bipartisanship are very high now. I mean, probably worse than when Obama was in office, because at least then there were more Republican moderates in Congress. And more members of Congress who were in districts that had split their ticket. Now, I mean, I think we're down to like 16 districts in all of Congress that have split their tickets, and I think we're down to only 6 states now that have even split congressional delegations. So all of the incentives are for Republicans to oppose the Biden administration and the Democrats. So I think that the problem is quite bad. And also, I mean, as we're seeing play out in real time, the Republican Party is more concerned about alienating the Marjorie Taylor Greene supporters than they are about alienating Liz Cheney's supporters. So the Marjorie Taylor Greene contingent is not a contingent that is going to tolerate any compromise with the Democrats.
Yeah, and maybe we can take up that discussion later on. I think maybe right after the election, a lot of people are wondering what the Republican Party coalition would look like, and maybe we're beginning to see that now. Maybe it's the Liz Cheney wing and the Marjorie Taylor Greene piece of it. But before getting into questions like that, I wanted to back up and ask about your book. The title is very dramatic, The Two-Party Doom Loop. I think for many Americans, it's counterintuitive because we've had the two-party system for a very long time. For Americans paying attention to politics, the two-party system is kind of like a fish swimming in water. It's kind of hard to imagine other alternatives because this is the one we've been in so far. And yet you argue, as the title suggests, that this two-party system is generating itself. The fact that it's two parties is generating a huge amount of toxicity in American politics, and that we're pulling further and further apart. What are a couple of the most important mainsprings of that dynamic? Why these two parties, why you think the two parties are generating the toxicity and driving each other and Americans apart?
Yeah, so I think certainly you're right that we've always had two major parties in the U.S., a function of our first past the post, winner take all electoral institutions combined with a presidential electoral college system. But for most of our political history, those two parties have really been these loose overlapping coalitions. For most of American history, the real action was at the state party level. And the national parties, it would come together every 4 years to nominate a candidate for president, but they didn't really stand for all that much. In fact, there was a very famous report by the American Political Science Association in 1950 that complained that the problem with American politics is that we don't have responsible parties. The parties are incoherent. They don't stand for anything, and voters don't have clear choices. They don't know what the parties actually stand for. And actually, the problem is that we need parties that have clear programs. Now, this falls into the category of be careful what you wish for. But I think it's important to understand how unusual it is to have what we have now, which is actually a fully sorted two-party system. That one of the things I argue in the book is that for a good portion of the second half of the 20th century, we had something more like a four-party system with liberal Republicans. I mean, you can think Charlie Baker in Massachusetts. And even Mitt Romney as governor, right? That this was an important part of the Republican Party, and you also had a lot of conservative Democrats who came from the South and some rural areas. And at this within this four-party system, we had potential for lots of different coalitions coming together, and both parties had liberal and conservative wings. So whether Republican Party was in the White House or a Democratic Party was in the White House, you'd still have this sort of overarching cooperation. Lots of districts were split ticket districts. Lots of states were split states. And that allowed a certain compromise fluidity to coalitions. Now that began to collapse in the 1990s for various reasons, and since the 1990s, we've had what political scientists call the kind of the sorting of the parties, where the Republican Party has become much more a party of conservative rural America, and the Democratic Party has become much more a party of liberal, cosmopolitan, urban America. And what we've seen is this incredible geographic separation of the two parties. That the greatest divide is a density divide in American politics, a rural-urban divide. And what that does is it creates two parties that are entirely separate from each other. So there's none of the cross-cutting cleavages that kind of kept politics moderate and stable, and that sort of scholars of democracy say, that one of the most important things to have the stable democracy is to have cross-cutting cleavages where people are kind of caught between different alliances. And now all of the important political identities of race, religion, culture are all stacking on top of each other in a fully sorted two-party system, which is roughly balanced at the national level. And you add in winner-take-all elections in this two-party system, and every election is an election for the fate of the nation. I mean, the Republican National Convention, I think the most important speech of the Republican National Convention was a speech by Mike Pence in which he said, this is an election about whether America remains America. And when you create a two-party system divided on that fundamental cleavage of national identity, you create a very dangerous political environment in which winning determines who counts in America.
Yeah, it is worth remembering that it wasn't so long ago in the 90s and before, in which people who didn't really pay that much attention to politics kind of had a hard time telling the difference between the two parties, right? There was a lot of, as you say, a huge amount of overlap in, liberal Republicans, conservative Democrats. But one reason people who study non-voting give for the non-voting is it's hard to tell for a lot of non-voters what the difference was. And now, that claim, right? Everybody knows what the difference is because the difference has gotten so much more vast.
I think that was the core argument of the vanishing voter, right?
Yeah. And so it's worth remembering that how much the political reality has changed in America on just that dimension. I guess, my glib way of putting it is, if it's between a Bush and a Gore, right? Like, how much difference is there really? Of course, there are substantial differences, but those differences are minuscule compared to how people perceive the difference between Donald Trump and a Joe Biden, as you say, right? So, political scientists like you and I often talk in this way of polarization and overlapping cleavages, cross-cutting cleavages, and the sorting, geographic sorting, ideological sorting. But a lot of Americans, and I suspect a lot of people in the audience, are saying, what are you guys talking about? There's no symmetry here. Suggesting that the two parties are somehow equally responsible. There's one party that's causing the problems and the toxicity, and that is the party that is trying to diminish the size of the franchise, whose supporters are resorting to violence, that's where the toxicity is coming from. And if they would just stop it, things would be a lot better. What do you think?
So yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that I've wrestled with a lot, because it's clear to me, and I think clear to anybody, that the Republican Party has become a liberal party. I think the Republican Party became a liberal party on January 6th, when members of Congress, or really in the aftermath of January 6th, when Republican members of Congress, basically said, well, it's not a big deal that the sitting president of the United States incited a mob to storm the Capitol because he refused to acknowledge an electoral defeat. And I mean, it's been trending this way for a while. And, democracy is a difficult thing to maintain if you have one of the two major parties that does not believe in free and fair elections. But it's also a difficult thing to maintain more broadly when there's not a shared sense of what are fair processes. Now, polarization is sort of you can think of it as a relational concept, in that, you have two parties that are further and further apart. But you can also think of it as a function of hyper-partisanship, that you two parties that view the other side as fundamentally enemies, and not as fellow citizens of the country, but as threats to the nation. Now, there is some symmetry, and I've seen some polling around that. But the problem is, what do you do with when one party is fundamentally a liberal, and the other party is fundamentally liberal? And that creates a tremendous challenge, because on the one hand, and I make no secret of the fact that I'm a Democrat, and I align with the Democratic Party. So wearing my Democratic jersey, I'd say, well, of course the problem is the Republicans, and the key is just we have to crush the Republicans, and we have to pass all kinds of voting reforms that make it easier for people to vote, and then the Republican Party will,
You're on the record, by the way, favoring all of those such reforms.
Yeah, exactly. So of course I favor those, exactly. So I favor all those reforms. At the same time, I don't think they're enough, because the challenge is that if you have two major parties, and one of those two major parties is fundamentally a liberal and does not believe in free and fair elections in which everybody votes equally, you can't sustain a democracy. And we have lots of examples around the world of how democracies break down, and they all involve intense polarization in a binary way, with one party that becomes authoritarian, a liberal, and that's the most dangerous condition. So the argument of for electoral reform, which is what I advocate in the book, moving to a more proportional system, is that the only way forward is that we have to find a space for a pro-democracy right party to emerge. And within our current political system, that space has disappeared. And the only way to create that space is a proportional system in which liberal Republicans can run independently of conservative or Trump, MAGA, whatever you want to call these. I call them MAGA, America Firsters, Patriot Party Republicans, who don't represent anywhere close to a majority. I mean, depending on how you want to count the support, I would say it's probably about 15 to 20% of the country. Now, that's similar to far-right populist parties in Germany, say, although the AfD. But difference between Germany and the U.S. is that in Germany you have a proportional system in which the center-right party, Merkel's party, the CDU, can form a coalition with the center-left party, the SPD, and they can form essentially a cordon sanitaire, marginalize the far right, keep them out of power. And in Germany, the AfD is actually losing support. It's down to less than 10%. But in the U.S., because there's no space for that center-right faction to operate independently in a system of winner-take-all two-party elections, it's just fighting a losing battle within a Republican coalition that is rooted in parts of the country that are overly culturally conservative and represent the declining white evangelical electorate that feels under tremendous sense of threat. And that because they are declining and because they already rely on minoritarian institutions, they're going to push harder to restrict the franchise, to engage in aggressive gerrymandering, to preserve their shrinking power.
Good. And I want to get to the multi-party proportional ideas in just a moment. A couple of things. The one thing that multi-party systems allow for is all kinds of alliances that you would not expect. And just in the German case, I don't know how many the Germans are in the audience, but what we might see is a center-right, the CDU, as you say, coalition with the Greens. And you think, well, why would they be in coalition with the Greens? And Wolfgang Streeck, a German political scientist, offered the observation a few years ago. Well, the Greens are basically the vegan wing of the Christian Democratic Party, meaning, well, they're, kind of upper class, professional, but have these, Whole Foods shopping tendencies, which I thought was an interesting observation. For people keeping score in the audience, Lee has proposed two different paths forward that we want to put in conversation for one another with one another. And I think a lot of people on the capital D Democratic side of the ledger have in their mind a majoritarian way forward, that the capital D Democrats get 51% of the votes, shove through things like HR1 and S1, anti-racist policies, and run the table. And that's the way to make democracy better. So that's path one, the majoritarian path. And Lee is putting on the table not the majoritarian path, but a proportional and multi-party path that is innovative and provocative. And so we'll put those two ideas into conversation more in a moment. But first, right before we do that, I wanted to ask you about the racial justice and multi-racial inclusive democracy priority. This summer, in the midst of COVID-19, we saw what was perhaps the most widespread protest ever in this country around racial justice. It was a reminder to me, to everyone who watched, I think, of just how far America has to go before we achieve an inclusive multiracial democracy. Now, Lee, you might think that the Democratic Party seems to have deeply embraced racial justice more deeply. And so within the context of this two-party system, we're pushing inclusion forward to the extent that capital E Democrats have political power. So, some of these other doom loop questions aside, do you think that the American two-party system is helping out the cause of multiracial democracy because it seems to be such a core part of the Biden-Harris agenda at this point?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about. So I think it's certainly the case that it's racial justice has become a key part of the Democratic Party agenda, as the Democratic Party itself has become really a strongly multiracial coalition. Now, at the same time, the Republican Party has become much more extreme in its white nationalist, basically anti-pluralist view. So on the one hand, we see progress. On the other hand, we see tremendous opposition from that progress, which is certainly the course of things. You get progress, you get backlash. However, one of the things that makes this incredibly volatile is the fact that we've created a two-party system that is forcing people to make a binary choice on national identity. And so one of the reasons why you see the Republican Party becoming more explicitly white nationalist is because in a binary system, and that elevates this question of national identity in a winner-take-all context, the Republican Party sees a potential to gain votes by creating an exaggerated threat of what a multiracial democracy would look like as a way to win elections, because the logic of zero-sum lesser of two evils politics is to make the other side seem more evil. So what's happened, rather than saying, all right, well, this is okay because we're a nation of immigrants, the Republican Party has sort of done a caricature of Black Lives Matter and of social justice movements as dangerously violent when they're not, as sort of dangerously radical when they're not, and that has an effect because most people follow elite cues in party politics, and if you're a Republican and you're watching about this cancel culture every night on Fox News and OAN, you suddenly feel like it's a real threat, which makes you more radicalized. This is again emerges from the binary conflict. Now, there's there's a lot to say on this topic, and we could talk about this for quite a while. I'll just say two other things. One is that I last month or so I've been spending a lot of time looking at what election systems experts recommend for divided, pluralistic, multi-ethnic societies in terms of electoral institutions. And there's some debate on various types of proportional systems, but here's what they don't recommend: is creating winner-take-all systems in which you divide people into two competing camps and set them for in a fight for narrow majority control. What overwhelmingly recommend is a system that's more proportional, that allows for more fluid coalitions. Again, we get back to this fundamental point of cross-cutting dynamics in political systems, and also creates space for different realignments and different coalitions, and that's just become so crucial. Now, the flip side of that is what has the two-party system meant for minority representation in American politics? And Paul Freimer is a political scientist at Princeton, written a really, I think, incredibly insightful book called Uneasy Alliances, which he talks about the argument of electoral capture, that because there's only two parties, that once a minority group gets essentially captured in the Democratic coalition, it doesn't have a ton of leverage. And he argues that this has been sort of the story of Black voters in American politics, is that as they became part of the Democratic coalition, they lost the leverage that they might have had to demand more racial justice policies that were more in line with racial justice, because the swing constituency was always the white, more culturally conservative voters, and that is still the swing constituency in American politics. And I think that will still limit the ability of Democrats to pursue a racial justice agenda. And we could talk more broadly, but I mean, I think the bottom line here is that overwhelmingly, if you look at comparative electoral systems, experts will tell you that the more proportional system, the better it is for minority representation, the better it is for an inclusive multi-ethnic democracy. And the absolute worst thing you could do is to create this binary winner-take-all dynamic in which elections are about the identity of who we are as a nation, and kind of reify a very black or white view of national identity.
Yeah, that's great. And for the reading list out there, people who might be interested, who are interested in African-American power in the context of the two-party system, my former colleague Leah Wright-Rigueur has a fabulous book, The Loneliness of the Black Republican, which looks historically at Republican leaders within the African-American leaders within the Republican Party trying to carve out space, whether their idea is economic independence or self-sufficiency, but it's just really hard to get traction for some of the reasons that Lee points out. All right, I think a lot of people, judging from the Q&A and some of the questions before, are eager to get to the all-important question about what to do about the two-party doom loop, how to make it better. And Lee, you've already indicated that broadly speaking, you would like to move toward a more proportional system, but this is not Europe. We have a two-party system. We have a first past the post. And so let's talk about some of the measures, either things we can do in the short term and things we can do might be done in the longer term to move towards some proportionality. Before we do that, I'm going to paste in the chat, if I can, an excerpt from this article by Tom Edsall. I can't do it. Never mind. I'll try to figure it out while this goes on. In which a polling firm has asked people, well, if there were 5 parties in the United States, who would you support? And there's a nationalist right-wing party, and they would get 19% support. A traditional conservative party about free enterprise and traditional family and they'd get 21%. So that's like 40% of the population. There's a culturally liberal and globalist party with a platform about social progress, women, LGBTQ, minority rights and inclusion, but about capitalism. So these are your friends on the Upper East Side, not to draw too much of a stereotype. They get Upper East Side of Manhattan. They get about 12% of the vote. And then the center left party, about the middle class, universal health care, labor unions, they get 28%. And then the Green New Deal party gets 10%. So nobody gets anything like close to 50%, and it's spread out according to the survey, which is pretty interesting. So I'll see if I can post that in the chat. Lee, so what are some of the steps that you could imagine, either at the state level or at the national level, bringing us toward some proportionality and multi-party competition?
Yeah. Well, the key is multi-member districts, right, that are proportionally allocated. So I'm not talking like the old block voting, which was used to limit civil rights. I'm talking about proportional multi-member districts. Now, there's a few ways to do proportional representation, and every country has a different version. I think generally the consensus is that you want to have, multi-member districts, but like not super large. Like you don't want to be Israel, where you have, the entire Knesset is elected in one district. But rather, what I have in mind is something like Ireland, where you have 5-member districts elected by ranked choice. Well, actually, it's the Cambridge, Massachusetts uses this system, but they use it with nonpartisan elections, which makes it confusing for voters. So, I mean, I think you want to recognize that parties are essential. Now, there is legislation in the House, the Fair Representation Act, which actually would do this. It would create multi-member districts for House seats with ranked choice voting. That would also put in place ranked choice voting for Senate elections. And I think that would that would go a long way towards creating space for more parties. I think increasing the House size of the House would also help, and that bill actually does that. I think that would go a long way. Now we could debate. There's so that's the Irish model, proportional representation. There's also German New Zealand model, which is a mixed member system, which is half single winner district constituency based and then half party list based. There's open list PR, which is used in Belgium and Finland. But I mean, the broader point here, and I'm happy to get into the weeds here because this stuff is so fascinating. But I mean, the broader point is that the number of parties is a function of district size and allocation rules. So if you have larger districts where seats are allocated proportionally to the share of the district, you get more parties. And if you have single winner districts like we have with plurality voting, you're most likely to have just 2 parties.
Good. And one question, there's a lot of questions from the audience. One that is striking asks about the path. So can you think of, and I'm racking my brain myself, think of examples either from other countries or from states in the United States that have exhibited a little bit of a doom loop dynamic, but have managed to pull back from it, perhaps through going to some PR system or some other way?
Yeah, so the best example comes from New Zealand. Now, in the 1980s, New Zealand politics was incredibly dysfunctional. At the time, New Zealand had a very pure Westminster-style system, very much like the British system of single winner plurality districts, and they had a bunch of plurality reversals in which the party that won the most votes, which was the Liberal Party, or the Liberal Party, actually wound up with a minority, and the party that won fewer seats, which was the kind of the right-wing party, won more seats in the legislature, and they had this kind of buffoonish populist prime minister. And there was just like this incredible distrust in political institutions. In New Zealand, they had enacted these very unpopular austerity policies, and there was a sense that something needed to change, and there was a national commission that recommended moving to a proportional system, and they put it up for a vote, and New Zealanders overwhelmingly voted to become a more proportional system. They copied the German model of mixed member proportional, and now New Zealand has been a thriving democracy. Confidence in institutions has increased by all measures. The quality of New Zealand democracy has increased tremendously from the 90s when 93 they voted to change. 96 was the first election. So I think that's probably the shining example of transition from a system that was unfair to a system that was more proportional. I mean, the first wave of movement to proportional voting systems it swept Western Europe from 1899 to 1919, and there are a bunch of reasons why various European countries did that. But I mean, basically, the trend among democracies going back to 1899, Belgium was the first country that did it, and they had they basically solved a civil war problem there, and that they've managed, despite being a very divided country between the Flemish and the Walloons, the French speakers and the Dutch speakers. Belgium has managed to hang together as a nation. I mean, they've had some challenges forming coalition governments, but a lot of people think that the proportional system saved them. But no country has ever gone from being a proportional system to a majoritarian system.
Yeah, and I just want to ask a little bit. Whoever's host, Melissa, if you're host, could you give me screen sharing? I just want to follow up on the New Zealand issue. So what are the lessons for the United States, and what are the conditions? It feels like one of the conditions is that both parties feel like they get the short end of the stick from the existing electoral system. So they are both supportive of some kind of reform. And I mean, it sure feels like the US satisfies that condition now, as long as we have the electoral college. So are there other conditions that you think are important is the US close to a New Zealand moment or far from it?
I mean, I hope we're close to a New Zealand moment. I mean, I think generally, I mean, when you look more broadly at electoral system change, there seems to be a few conditions that need to be met. One is a overwhelming sense that we have a problem, and I think that condition largely seems to be met. Second condition is that we have a sense of what the alternative ought to be, and I feel like here we have a lot of work to do. And then the third condition is that politicians who would vote to enact such a change have to think that they'll do at least as well, if not better, under a new set of voting rules. And that's also a challenge. Now, I mean, I think here you might say, well, of course, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, why would they ever vote a system that basically would undermine the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? And there's a couple ways to think about it. One is that within those parties, there are factions that feel like they're getting the short end of the stick, so that the parties themselves are these broad coalitions. And interestingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, in my conversations, the most enthusiasm for these reforms comes from the center right and the Never Trumpers, and the Justice Democrats, the progressive left, who both feel like they're they're on the margins here and they'd like to see more representation. But at the same time, I think you could also see support, and I've seen some support for this, not as much, from the sort of more moderate wing of the Democratic Party, who feels like, they would like a system, one that generates more compromise, and two that frees them from having to be associated with the defund the police wing of the Democratic Party. The point about uncertainty that you were raising, Archon, is actually I think the pivotal point in the adoption of PR systems in Western Europe in the first part of the 20th century is that you had a lot of wild swings back and forth because of the way that the majoritarian single winner districts were working, although a lot of those countries did have something like a multi-party system. But there was a sense that the socialists were gaining power. There was an expansion of the franchise, and a lot of the support for the reforms in Western Europe at that time came from conservative parties who felt that they were going to be wiped out entirely, and the proportional system gave them more of a share that was in line with their population, as well as the socialists who, while they were gaining power, often felt that their representation was not equal to their voting share because they were overconcentrated in urban districts. So I think we are at a moment in which there is a lot of uncertainty about who's going to take power, and I think there's a sense that a lot of wild swings are not good for the stability of American democracy. And finally, I do think that there are a lot of members in Congress who are really frustrated with how the hyper-polarization is affecting their work. And I don't think you can find a member of Congress who would stand up and say, "Oh, gee, things are working really well." But it's a challenge to get them to see, all right, well, here's a different system. Now, there is legislation in the House, Fair Representation Act. One of the co-sponsors is the new all-star of the Democratic Party, Jamie Raskin. So there's
good. There. So I want to show this picture from your book. One of the diagrams that I found, I kind of knew this at some level, but to see you sketch it out, and it's very surprising, I think, for an American audience. And can you guys see that? Hold on.
You expand that to do it full screen.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
The left panel there is the number of effective political parties in many states. And as you can see, the US and the Hungary are the only democracies, and Lee's kind of wrapped his arms around a bunch of them in the world that have two effective parties, right? And so the next one out is the UK, with, I suppose, the Liberal Party as the one between Labour and Tory. And then it kind of goes on from there. And the outliers are Iceland, Israel, Belgium, and the Netherlands, which have between 7 and 8 effective parties. So the US is a real outlier in the world stage in having our two-party system. And that's not, I think, unrelated to the fact that our Constitution is the oldest on this list. Good. All right. So question for you, Lee, how do you think about the relationship between reform at the state level toward proportionality through ranked choice voting, as we have in a couple of states now, I guess, and other forms of proportionality? How does the state level reform effort fit into the national effort? Do we have to have a lot of states doing this first to make it plausible for people to generate some national models? What do you think?
I'm not sure. I've gone back and forth on this question, as have a lot of folks in this advocacy space. It is. I think one thing that's important to understand is that there's the single winner ranked choice voting, which maintains the single member district, which was what was on the ballot in Massachusetts last year, what passed in Maine, what passed in Alaska. And then there's the proportional multi-winner form of ranked choice voting, which has not been on the ballot anywhere, although maybe it will be in 2022. There's some there's some potential that some states will be interested in that. I think both. It's important to pursue it at both the federal level and at the state level. I think it's in some ways, the threshold for affecting change at the state level is lower. And there is a powerful demonstration effect. I mean, I think certainly the success of campaigns in Maine and Alaska has kind of created a new plausibility for electoral reform that wouldn't have existed otherwise, and raise the profile of the issue in a way that gets people talking about it. I mean, but at the same time, given the sort of overwhelming nationalization of American politics and the extent to which so much is focused on what happens in Washington, and the sort of centrality of the Congress, that clearly doing it at the federal level would be the most powerful and most important thing to do, and that would kind of filter down to the state level. So I think we ought to be doing all of the above, and I mean that state, city, national, and there's different opportunities for different folks to get involved at different levels. And I think the more people who get involved in thinking about how they want their democracy to operate, the better, because ultimately this is a conversation that we all need to be having with each other. And I think one of the things that we've kind of not really thought about collectively is, what kind of democracy do we really want to have? We sort of take it for granted that, no, well, this is just how U.S. democracy works, because it's worked that way in the past. But one of the things, when you look at the broader scope of the history of American democracy, is that we've had these various moments in which social movements have emerged to say, we can do better. We don't have to do democracy in the way that we did it in the past, because we see the flaws in that, and we can become at every the Revolutionary War was a social movement that said we can have self-governance. We don't need to be ruled by a king. Progressive era was an era of social movements in which says we want politics to be more participatory. The civil rights era was an era in which great social movements emerged. That it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is. Everybody should have the right to vote equally and be counted equally. And I think we could see the sort of emergence of a new democracy social movement that will say, we want a more inclusive and representative democracy in which it doesn't matter where you vote or where you live, your vote counts equally, and in which we get more choices that represent the diversity that is this country, and not put everybody into the Procrustean beds of just one or the other parties. Parties.
I think there's an interesting moral dimension. We've been talking a lot about the toxicity and the very practical and urgent problems of the illnesses that face democracy, our two-party system, democracy in our two-party form. There's an interesting moral dimension to it, which is that in the two-party doom loop dynamic, right? Actually, voters don't get to vote for what they really stand for. And even leaders don't get to stand for what they believe in, because the two-party dynamic is driving excessive opposition, whether you hate the other side or not. That's kind of, you're on the puppet strings of this two-party doom loop. But in a proportional system, right, leaders would get to stand for what they believe in, whether you're a Green New Deal person or a build the wall higher person, you'd get to stand for that. And voters would get to vote for what they really want, as opposed, like right now, the hardcore Bernie person really didn't in the general election get to vote for who he wanted to vote for. And the moderate Republican, the Mitt Romney type person, didn't get to vote for what he or she really wanted, right? So that, I was just kind of trying to lift up the what's to be said on the moral dimension of a multi-party system.
And I mean, you see a lot of evidence for this. In proportional systems, people are more satisfied with democracy because they feel like they got to express their view better. And two, you just see much higher levels of citizen engagement and participation. The U.S. is consistently one of the lowest turnout democracies, but also UK and Canada are also low turnout democracies because they're two or two-ish party systems with first past post elections in which a lot of districts are just not competitive. And the advantage of one value of a proportional system is just that you have competition everywhere because there are no safe seats. Your vote matters whether you live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or suburban Philadelphia. And also with more candidates and more parties, there's more people reaching out to voters and engaging voters. Voters are more likely to also feel like they have a candidate who they're excited about. And we know from tremendous amounts of research that there's all kinds of downstream benefits from more competitive elections. People are more likely to be engaged in politics, and there's more likely to be spillover effects into other forms of civic participation and volunteerism from people being engaged. So I think there are tremendous downstream effects to having a more the higher turnout that would result from more proportional and more party elections. And also in terms of how politicians campaign, in a two-party election, you can just run your campaign. Well, that person is extreme and dangerous, and don't talk at all about what you stand for. In fact, that's largely what the 2020 election was. Just trying to cast the other side as more extreme. But if there's more than two candidates, you don't have that dynamic. There's no phrase lesser of three evils. Though actually, in my crack research for the book, I did find that it was a martial arts, original title of a martial arts film, which was very poorly reviewed and later renamed Fists of the Warrior. But that was the only use that I could find, right? But you think about the Democratic primary as an example in which there are multiple candidates. And instead of saying, well, this other candidate is terrible, they had to stand for different policy programs. And what you see in multi-party elections, sure, there's some negative campaigning, but there's a lot more. Here's what my policy vision is, and here's how it's different. Not the other side is extreme and dangerous, and that creates a different dynamic in politics.
Good. And so Alex Kazar, my colleague, great historian of democracy, asks a question, and I'll pose it both at his level, but also at the personal level for you, which is, have you found much purchase among professional politicians for this proposal? That's the To Lee question. And then Alex's form of it as an historian is, look, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was room for third, fourth parties in a lot of places. And the two major parties implemented many, many rules to solidify their duopoly and lock those third, fourth, and fifth parties out. So I think Alex expects a great amount of resistance from the capital E Democrats and the capital R Republicans for any microscopic move in the directions that you suggest.
Yeah, and I think I see his book on your shelf, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Which is an excellent book, and I just say I really enjoyed it and learned a ton from his history of the Electoral College, which is also about how hard it is to enact major reforms. And certainly a major reform like changing the voting system would go up against the capital D, capital R Republican parties. I would, however, note that in that earlier era, that the parties themselves were much stronger institutions and much better organized at the state and local level, so that there were like real party organizations that were really trying to shut out competition. The parties today are not really institutionalized and strong organizations as they were in that earlier era. They're sort of these loose networks of campaign consultants and lawyers and activists, but they're not strong in the way that they were in that earlier era. And in fact, I think they're incredibly internally divided. And so in some ways, like who is the Democratic Party? Who is the Republican Party? And so there are certainly the way you build support for reform is not from Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer down, but it's from members up, who eventually Schumer and Pelosi will get where their members are. And there is certainly support for Fair Representation Act. It's got a bunch of co-sponsors in the House, including Jamie Raskin and I think Representative McGovern, who are kind of adjacent to party leadership. I mean, I think it would have more support if but I mean, Democrats are obviously focused on HR1 as their urgent priority, and just these reforms haven't been socialized. But informally talking to a number of staffers who work for members, I think there's enthusiasm for this idea, and I think they understand the importance of it. And anyway, ultimately, I mean, yes, members of Congress are partisans. Yes, they're re-election seeking, but I think a lot of them also are engaged in politics because they want to work on public policy and making the country better. Less and less of them, unfortunately, more and more just want to get on TV and raise money for their celebrity. But still, I do look at the history of American democracy reform, and while it's true, that ballot access laws became more restrictive, states and Congress passed direct election of senators, the initiative and referenda in more than half of the states, the direct primary, and almost got rid of the Electoral College 4 times. not quite, but I mean, there were at least 4 times when one of the chambers passed it with a super majority. So when the stars align, things could happen.
So Lee, last question to go out on. This one is pithy, and I hope it doesn't offend people as a little bit too glib. But imagine the 2024 election and it's 2023. If you had the opportunity to wave your wand and get a multi-party set of reforms, and you knew that the result of that would be a very robust MAGA/Patriot Party, as well as a pretty robust AOC Bernie squad party, would you take that deal? So there would be 4 in that scenario, right?
Yeah, absolutely, I would. I think, I mean, one of the things that you have to think about is like what that dynamic, right? I mean, basically the problem is that our system is stuck right now. And we're in this narrow trench warfare in which not much happens, and everything is really ugly, and we keep digging ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole. And yeah, it might be that you get a robust MAGA party and a robust AOC party, but then suddenly we know where the balance is, and it creates opportunities for new coalitions. And you might find that there's more space for different coalitions when you don't have 2 armies fighting for this narrow majority control. I mean, democracy is not a system in which we all agree. It's a system in which we resolve our disagreements through elections and through governance. And so it would I think create some action and some fluidity and some potential realignments. And I'd rather, I mean, right now what we have is just this sense that everything is stuck, and we have to, and if you unstick things, you might get a little chaos. But if you think of it in terms of democracy as a complex system, you need, for a complex system to to work, there needs to be a little bit of sort of small scale instability in order for the larger system to be stable. I mean, the most dangerous thing in a complex system is if things can't adjust, and if there's no opportunity, if there's too much small scale stability, the whole system becomes unstable at a large scale. And so what we have is too much small scale stability, and the entire system is unstable at the large scale. What we need essentially is more small scale instability and change and fluidity to allow the system to be responsive at a large scale.
Thank you very much, Lee. There's like a ton of great questions in the chat, and I apologize that we didn't get to those, but it's evidence of how rich this discussion has been and how much people care about what just a few years ago we would regard as a very abstract kind of non-urgent question. But the reality has really come home that we need to think ambitiously and deeply about how to fix our democracy. And Lee, thank you very much for helping us all to do that.
Yeah, well, thank you for hosting this conversation, and I'm excited to keep this dialogue going. I mean, I think this question of how we keep our democracy moving forward, and have a democracy that works in a diverse, multi-ethnic society is, I think, the crucial question of our times.
I totally agree. Thank you very much, and have a good day, everyone, and stay safe.